Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this mini-symposium on race and racism in science. Thank you to the organizers for making space for this mini-symposium. The background of this symposium is, of course, everything that happened in the past year, where the Black Lives Matter movement affected many countries all across the world and drew attention to systemic anti-Black racism at all levels of society. And as a scientific community, just like so many other communities, we've often responded by looking inside our own institutions to see how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be improved. And that's incredibly important, but there's also something that has been sometimes missing from these discussions, which is how the content of scientific research and the scientific practice can themselves potentially be racist. Now, of course, it's really comfortable to believe that science is somehow value-free and somehow magically insulated from the personal motivations or biases or simply the plain ignorance of its practitioners. And to is a step towards hopefully undermining that notion. We will be starting by trying to understand the role of race and racism in the history of science. And we are particularly going to emphasize fields that are adjacent to neuroscience or biology, psychology, medicine, and artificial intelligence. For example, biologists have long attempted to define the very concept of race and its correlates. Some branches of science, such as IQ research, have deeply racist roots. And in case you think that this is just left in the past, modern scientific practice in medicine and artificial intelligence contains many examples of unintentional racism, ranging from merely unhelpful to potentially lethal. So I'm happy to introduce you to today's speakers and panelists. David Gresham and Habon Issa, they will each speak for 20 minutes. David, Habon, and I previously worked together to develop a short course at NYU on the topic of today, as well as on several public events on anti-racism. So David is a professor of biology at NYU. He has worked on the interface, is working on the interface of molecular biology and evolution. He did his PhD in human genetics and was previously an editor at Nature Genetics. When David was faculty at Princeton, he developed and taught an undergraduate writing course on science, race, and racism. David is going to speak about the historical origins of scientific racism. Habon is a PhD student in neuroscience at NYU, has been active in mobilizing the community around diversity, equity, inclusion issues in her capacity as a leader of the Neuroscience Student Council, NeuroPIL. Habon is going to discuss cases of racism in modern medicine and AI. So during this session, we would like to hear from you. So first, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Maybe you want to say a little bit about your background so we know who we're talking to. And then all questions can go into the Slido functionality. We're going to take some questions right after each 20-minute talk and then have a longer panel discussion afterwards. So our first speaker is going to be David Gresham on scientific racism. David.
Well, thanks, Weiji, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming along today to hear this presentation. So I'd like to start with an advertisement that I recently saw from the DNA genotyping company Ancestry.com. This is one of those leading companies to which you can provide a saliva sample, and in return, they will perform whole genome genotyping and make inferences about your ancestry.
Greatness lives within all of us. And with Ancestry DNA on sale for just $69, now is the time to discover yours. You can find out where you get your precision, your grace, your drive. And now, with more than 150 ethnic regions to connect to, only Ancestry DNA can put your greatness on full display. Save 30% now at ancestrydna.com.
So as scientists, we are likely appalled by the suggestion that particular groups of people are associated with particular heritable characteristics such as these. The idea that grace is inherited by virtue of Asian ancestry, that precision is inherited by virtue of Scandinavian ancestry, and that drive comes from your British ancestry is both scientifically implausible and reflects antiquated thinking about human populations. The idea that there are different types of humans simply has no scientific basis, we would contend. Indeed, most scientists would state that the classification of humans into these broad categories that we define races has no genetic basis, and that such classifications
Greatness lives within all of us.
Sorry, we don't need to see that again. Such classifications reflect lived experience and only loosely connected to ancestry. And thus, race is a social construct with no genetic basis. And this indeed was a claim that was made by the anthropologist Ashley Montagu in 1942. However, what I want to do today is remind you of that the classification of humans into distinct groups with distinct characteristics is indeed a concept that originated as a scientific idea. Human races began as a typological classification developed by natural scientists in the 18th century. And a survey of the history of race as a scientific concept reminds us that scientific racism has played a central role in discrimination and oppression in our societies. To understand the historical context in which race, the scientific concept of race arose, there are two key factors to consider. The first is the Christian European conception of the world as the great chain of being, which organized all of existence into a hierarchical structure, laying out who has authority over who and placing humans only second to God. And this hierarchical structure persisted throughout scientific classifications of life. And the second is to consider that what we're talking about is the age of European exploration, in which European explorers went on sailing expeditions starting in the 1400s or so, resulting in Europeans encountering for the first time people from different parts of the world. So it was in this context that Carl Linnaeus published Systema Naturae in 1735 at the age of 28. In this major work, Linnaeus classified living organisms into kingdoms, and he was the first to classify humans into the animal kingdom. And he introduced in later editions the binomial nomenclature that we still use today and coined the term Homo sapiens as those animals that are able to know thyself. Now, there were multiple editions of Systema Naturae over the years. And in these editions, in the first editions 1 through 9, Linnaeus classified humans into 4 distinct varieties. These are the Americanus, Europaeus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. But it's apparent from correspondence that Linnaeus had at the time that he considered these different varieties of humans to be one and the same species. However, by the time the 10th edition of Systema Naturae was published, Linnaeus classified the different peoples of the world into a hierarchical structure with Americanus actually at the top and then Europaeus, Asiaticus, and Africanus at the bottom. But to these different groups, he ascribed different physical traits, as I am showing you here. In addition, he stated, behaviors that were characteristic of these different human varieties, including their manner of clothing and their forms of government. And it's an interesting historical side note that in addition to these 4 major types of humans, he included Homo monstrous, which included the Patagonian giant, the dwarf of the Alps, the cone-headed Chinese and flat-headed Canadians, and Homo ferus, which included known examples of wild humans, including the wolf boy of Hesse and the wild girl of Champagne. In Linnaeus's 1792 translation into English, he introduced the concept, the trinomial nomenclature, having a genus, a species, and a subspecies. And it was with this publication that the concept that different human varieties were really subspecies became entrenched. Shortly after Linnaeus's publications, the German anthropologist and zoologist Johann Blumenbach, in his publication on the natural variety of mankind, classified human races into 5 distinct races. This was based on morphology and high-tech measurements such as skull measurements at the time. And he defined the Caucasians or the white race, the Mongolians or the yellow race, the Malayan or the brown race, the Ethiopian or the black race, and the American or the red race. This too was a hierarchical classification. As he stated, I have allotted the first place to the Caucasian as I esteem it to be the primeval one. This diverges in both directions into the Ethiopians and into the Mongolians, and the remaining 2 occupy intermediate positions between the primeval one and these 2 extreme varieties. It's an interesting historical note that as a typologist, he was the one who introduced the term Caucasian, a term that we still use today. And the reason is that he said, I've taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus because it produces the most beautiful race of men. I mean the Georgians. And this, just for clarity, is the Georgians of Europe, as I've indicated on the map here. And he also said that these have the greatest probability to be where mankind originated. As he said, that stock displays the most beautiful form of the skull. It is white in color, the primitive color of mankind. As we know, it is easy for that to degenerate into brown, but much more difficult for brown to become white when the secretion and precipitation of this carbonaceous pigment has once deeply struck root. And it is peculiar for us to consider the fact that this term remains today. Biology then was transformed in the middle of the 1800s by the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And although Darwin published many additional books and works, including The Descent of Man and its selection in relation to sex, he had little to say on the subject of human typology. However, with respect to the relationship between races, he did say that the most weighty of all the arguments against treating the races of man as distinct species is that they can graduate into each other independently in many cases, as far as we can judge, of their having intercrossed. Nonetheless, he maintained a view of European superiority, stating that at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. But it was his cousin, Francis Galton at Cambridge University, the inventor of linear regression, if any of you have used that, which I'm sure you have. And it was Francis Galton, who was a geneticist who was concerned with the differential inheritance of desirable traits amongst human races. And in his study of the inheritance of intelligence in the publication of the book Hereditary Genius, he outlines a chapter discussing the comparative worth of different races with respect to their intellectual capability. And he states in this chapter that I shall make frequent use of the law of deviation from an average. I shall assume the intervals between the grades of abilities are all the same in all the races. And I see that the result, again, from my analysis, point to the conclusion that the average intellectual standard of the Negro is some 2 grades below our own. He, of course, ascribed the greatest intellectual capabilities to the ancient Greeks. And so to address the problem of the difference in human ability, Francis Galton introduced the concept of eugenics. He advocated positive eugenics, pointing to the success that controlled matings had had in increasing desirable traits in farm animals. And he advocated using the same approach to promote favorable matings among humans that would result in improved intellect. And this idea of eugenics became particularly popular when it crossed the Atlantic to the US. Charles Davenport, shown here, established the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor. This is actually a photo of the Carnegie Station at Cold Spring Harbor in the same location where the Cold Spring Harbor labs now are. And with funding from wealthy typhoons, Davenport, who had originally studied poultry, but was keen to apply these new advances to our understanding of the rules of inheritance in order to better society. So whereas Galton had advocated positive eugenics, promoting marriages and matings that would result in children with desirable traits, Charles Davenport introduced the idea of negative eugenics, calling for the preventing the reproduction of those who are genetically unfit, possibly by state-enforced sterilization, with the rationale that if the state had the right to take away life, that why shouldn't the state have the right to prevent undesirable births? But central to Davenport's ideas was a racist agenda. He studied interracial marriages, and in his publication stated that one often sees in mulattoes an ambition and push combined with an intellectual inadequacy, which makes the unhappy hybrid dissatisfied with his lot, and a nuisance to others. And he argued that race intermingling results in a hybridized people that are badly put together and dissatisfied, restless, and ineffective. It's important to recall that eugenics was taught as cutting-edge science in US academic institutions at the time, and it was funded by wealthy philanthropists. These are the textbooks from the beginning of the 20th century, and the contents of these textbooks gave scientific authority to policies such as the ban on interracial marriages, immigration bans against people from particular parts of the world. And moreover, the racism and bias that was perpetuated in these textbooks justified the continued discrimination and intolerance in society. These ideas of eugenics and being able to use our new understanding of human inheritance and to be able to improve society through this process gained a lot of traction, of course, in Nazi Germany. And it was in Nazi Germany that the complicity of scientists in providing a justification for the aberrant practices that went on there reached its zenith. In high school textbooks, children were introduced to the idea that so-called defectives should be removed from society as they imposed a burden on society. And it was as early as the 1920s that German scientists such as Erwin Bauer, Eugen Fischer, and Fritz Lenz published the textbook Human Heredity, Teaching, and Racial Hygiene. And this textbook had a major impacts. And this book ascended to become the standard text for substantiation of Nazi ideology, and the authors prided themselves on the fact that parts of their textbook were reflected in Hitler's speeches. And of course, we know all too well that the final result of the Nazis' concept of racial purity, and it's horrifying to consider the role that German scientists played in the justification, the scientific justification for the Holocaust. And it was in this context, following the Second World War, that leading scientists in the United States and throughout Europe, including well-known geneticists like Dobzhansky and anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss, composed a statement on the concept of race under the aegis of UNESCO. And in this statement, they asserted, they made the following statements about human equality. They stated that the mental capacities of all races are similar, that there's no evidence exists for biological deterioration as a result of hybridization, and that there is no correlation between national or religious groups in any particular race, and that race, they said, was less a biological fact than a social myth, and that biology proved the universal brotherhood of man. 20 years later or so, in 1972, the population geneticist Richard Lewontin at Harvard published the paper, The Apportionment of Human Diversity. And in this paper, Lewontin studied human polymorphisms in proteins and genes in people that came from different races, as shown on the right-hand side of your screen there. And using a statistical analysis similar to ANOVA, where he studied the apportionment of genetic variation, he's found that the total species diversity that is contained within populations is 85%, or much higher than that is accounted for by racial classifications. And he concluded that it is clear that our perception of relatively large differences between human races and subgroups as compared to the variation within these groups is indeed a biased perception, and that based on these randomly chosen genetic differences, human races and populations are remarkably similar. He goes on to say that human racial classification is of no social value and is positively destructive of social and human relations. And since such racial classifications can now be seen to be virtually no genetic or taxonomic significance, and so that no justification can be offered for its continuance. And indeed, this has become the consensus view throughout the academic community that among human populations, there are no differences large enough to support the concept of biological race, but instead it was argued that race is a social construct, and it's a way of categorizing people that changes over time and across countries. And so what I've hoped to have shown you today is that despite our current thinking of race as a social construct, that race indeed originated as a scientific concept, that science was used as justification for racist policies for several hundred years, and that scientists played a key role in advocating and advancing these racist policies. And that it was following the atrocities of World War II that scientists rejected the biological concept of race, and that it subsequently became to be considered a social construct. However, knowing this history, it's important for us to be able to look now at the way we continue to classify humans based on ancestry, morphology, and be careful about the extent to which we conflate social factors and biological factors, which continues to impact our biomedical research. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, David. We will be taking 1 or 2 questions now, so please type in Slido if you have any questions. I'll start with one. So you described how the consensus view among scientists is now that race is primarily a social construct. But as you showed in this opening video, the general public might have different conceptions of race than scientists. So where does that gap arise? Is that because the public is mostly still following the older science, or is there some for this?
Well, I think that's a very interesting and complex question, Weiji, but I think that is right. I think these old ideas that we in the scientific community have rejected have persisted in society, and then are, reinforced when we see things in popular culture, such as that advertisement from Ancestry.com. And so I think what this tells us is that we have a responsibility to be informing not only ourselves, but the larger community about these issues.
Thank you. So we're going to go to the next presentation by Habon Issa, PhD student at NYU, and she will be presenting case studies from artificial intelligence and medicine, actually in the opposite order. Go ahead, Habon.
Right, let me unmute. Hi, everyone. Once again, my name is Habon, and yeah, I'll be sharing a few case studies. Talking about how we can really recognize systemic racism in modern science. And rather than throw a bunch of numbers, because they're seemingly endless, I thought I would tell a few stories today. First, from the medical field, there will be some math, so hopefully it's a little close to home, artificial intelligence, and finally wrap up with some things that we can do as scientists. So beginning with the medical field, we will ask the question, should race be used in medicine? Right, underlying this particular question is another question. Is the risk associated with using race in medicine going to outweigh the benefit of potentially using this construct for more targeted care until we can find better factors? So the argument against invoking race in medicine is very strong. In the 60s and 70s, upwards of 70% of California radiologists actually admitted to using extra radiation on Black patients because they thought the skin was tougher. In 2016, 50% of white medical students believed in racial myths about differences in physiology. I'll talk a little bit about what happens when we find differences statistically along racial lines, because race isn't real. But this was really based in myth, and this ultimately impacted their treatment of Black patients. Additionally, in the 70s and 60s, you had medical students actually protesting because they were expected to train to learn procedures by performing unnecessary hysterectomies on Black women. Right now, we have a situation where maternal infant mortality is much higher among the Black population, 2 times higher for infants, and many times higher for moms. This disparity in maternal mortality is also present in the Latina and the Asian communities as well. On the other end, we have this argument that potentially the use of race in medicine can help more targeted treatments as long as we're responsible and we consider it to be a social construct. So I'm going to unpack an example specifically about this and see what the benefits and the costs are. This example is in the kidney, and at a high level, the function of the kidney, right, is to filter out waste. And so clinicians are able to get pretty accurate measures, but the best tests are very time consuming and they're also very expensive. And so they've often opted to measure some biomarkers for more quick bedside decisions. One such marker is creatinine, and for our purposes, creatinine is just waste generated by the body. And so if you take a simple blood test, you can get serum creatinine. If the levels of waste are high in the blood, you can say that a patient's kidney function is perhaps lower. Creatinine is not the best marker, it's not the most sensitive. And so specifically what that means is people then went on to create equations where you correct for several demographic variables to make the creatinine readout more accurate for populations, on average. So one such equation was created in 1999 in this paper. It's called the MDRD equation. Here it is. Here's the placeholder for serum creatinine, so that marker that we discussed. And you have corrections for age, if you're female or if you're African American. So why are we adding to the estimated kidney function for African Americans? It's because in this paper, they found that there was a difference between that group as a whole, where you had higher levels of creatinine. And so essentially, you could potentially be overestimating the kidney function of many African Americans within that group that actually have lower kidney function and are receiving this blanket correction for this huge arbitrary racial group. So let's discuss exactly where the differences come up, because race certainly isn't real, so why are African Americans different from white and other parts of the population? One reason is the social determinants of health, right? In subsequent studies, it was found that if you correct for things like economic stability and access to food and healthcare, you greatly attenuate the difference between Black people and others. For example, you still have a bit of a difference between Black people and others, but we don't have a full handle on how these social determinants make their way into the clinical setting. We also don't adequately use racism itself as a variable. There's also a little bit of room for ancestry, right? Even though you grouped all Black or African Americans in this particular study, you have only about 13% that show certain risk factors. And in Africa itself, you see that there are different amounts of risk factors distributed throughout the entire continent, where you could have anything from 0% to 50%. And so ancestry is removed from race. For example, a white individual might share more genetically with an individual with Asian ancestry than with another European descent white individual. And so you're basically taking a very arbitrary group and subjecting them to the same correction. On top of that, even the 13% of African Americans that have the high risk variants don't all go on to have chronic kidney disease. Once again, social determinants of health really determine where things end up going. So we can appreciate there are several problems with this use of race. First of all, you're singling out African Americans. There's no correction for any other group. And for a group that was so abused by the medical system, this is especially alarming. In the original study, you suggest that race is a biological factor, and it is not. And you're unnecessarily raising the estimate for kidney function for a large group of patients. This is going to delay their access to nephrology consults and delay their addition to the kidney transplant list. Here we see you need a GFR, or kidney filtration rate, of 15 to 29, so you can be prepared for kidney replacement. On top of all of this, as a group, African Americans, for social reasons, for example, have a more rapid decline in kidney function. So while they represent 13% of the United States population, they represent over 30% of those with chronic end-stage kidney disease. And so you're taking a group that's already at risk, putting them into a huge racial group, and putting them into more risk. This is a very active area of discussion, and there have been a number of proposed solutions. Students at the University of Washington Medical Center lobbied to basically remove the race coefficient, and this was actually successful at that institution. Others have updated the equation, so the original study in part suffered from a lack of representation across many populations. And even better, there's a suggestion to use better biologic markers. In this artistic rendering, you can see that the consensus is that serum creatinine isn't the best marker, and it doesn't do a lot to address early kidney disease, and a lot for acute versus chronic kidney diseases. So circling back to the original question, I don't want to say yes or no, should we use race? I do, however, want to point to 4 really nice guidelines in this consideration. First, if we use race, it should provide some sort of substantial benefit that we can't achieve without the danger of invoking race. Patients who reject or don't know their race categorization should be accommodated fairly, and the use of race should be transparent. We should also not recognize and also educate that race is not a biologic risk factor, and we should continue research into better risk factors to replace race. Next, I will talk about AI, and here we will ask, is AI effective in reducing bias where there's institutional racism? We ask this question because that is the stated purpose of AI. In the example I'll bring up, we'll talk about the criminal justice system, where decisions have long been biased, and the idea is that AI could potentially help. So AI is used everywhere in the criminal justice system. From before a crime begins, we have predictive policing from companies like Predpool that allow police departments to draw and use ROIs, take some information from those ROIs, including type of crime, date and time of crime, feed it into an algorithm provided by Predpool, and from that you get predictions on future crime hotspots. I think we can all guess that biased data going in, for example, different arrest rates for different populations, means biased results coming out if the algorithm isn't good enough in order to correct. Similarly, AI is used in sentencing and parole decisions. I'm going to start by playing a short video that basically summarizes its role in this particular area.
The justice system uses algorithms to predict if you'll recommit a crime. These algorithms are called risk assessment tools. And here's how they're used. Okay, let's say you've been convicted of a crime. You're serving your time in prison, and now you're up for parole. You would have what we call a parole hearing, where a group of people, a parole board, decides if you'll get out. And parole boards are typically made up of former law enforcement professionals, like, police, prosecutors, and prison guards. At the hearing, they ask you questions to try to figure out if you understand why you committed the crime, and if you have any strategies to prevent yourself from doing it again. They also consider things like your behavior in prison, and if you've gone through any prison programs like AA or anger management. And they use all this information to decide if you're ready to be released. Basically, they want to make sure that if you get out, you're not going to go and commit another crime. Well, parole boards are made up of humans, and we all come with bias. And a person's own biases might influence if he or she thinks you'll go on to commit another crime. And this is where risk assessment tools come in. Essentially, the tools use data to predict how likely you are to recommit a crime. And they make those predictions a lot like Netflix does. But instead of tracking what you're watching, they're looking for risk factors and are filled out a lot like questionnaires. They often take into account things like your age, your past criminal.
It's frozen for me. It is for me as well. Yes.
Okay. We'll give it one more shot. Otherwise, I have a summary just in case this happened.
Sure.
Yeah, so we'll move on. But we started to get a feel for COMPAS, which is a tool that is used in making things like parole decisions.
The justice system.
If the video failed you, as it did me, here's a summary. So the purpose of COMPAS, it's really a tool to predict recidivism. How likely is someone to go on to commit a crime? There are a bunch of different inputs, as you saw in the survey that we froze on. There are 137 possible risk factors in the survey, either directly answered by someone or pulled from your criminal record. For example, issues about arrest and also living situation. The output, after you put these inputs through an algorithm, is one risk score associated to an individual. The consequence is that if you have a lower risk score, it will be recommended that you have a shorter sentences. So conversely, if you have a high risk score, it will be recommended that you have a higher initial sentence or you remain in prison. There are a number of potential issues with COMPAS before we go on to evaluate its actual performance. First, before AI was even used in the criminal justice system, there was bias in defining criminality. For example, in the war on drugs, we had legislation that unequally targeted those from marginalized, poor, and communities of color. There's also bias in enforcement. For example, marijuana use is very similar between Black and white individuals, and yet Black arrests for this drug are much higher. There's a similar disparity in between the white and Latino communities, Latinx communities, except there's issues with reporting with respect to that particular community that actually make it hard for me to show you the exact numbers. There are also data and risk factors that track with race because of racism, right? For example, if you're using age at first arrest as a risk factor, and you have situations where there's a school to prison pipeline, you're disproportionately affecting young men of color that are disproportionately arrested for minor infractions. Other risk factors may include things like your zip code, which you have little to no control over, and things about your family and friends. Finally, there's a lack of transparency. So I didn't tell you exactly what goes into the algorithm, exactly what the algorithm is, and exactly what the weights are, because this is proprietary. And this is an additional problem, especially if AI itself shows the bias that humans do. So let's revisit the question, is AI effective in reducing bias with respect to a tool like COMPAS? The following couple of stories are from a ProPublica analysis. So let's examine the case of two individuals arrested for drug trafficking. Here are their priors that might be fed into the algorithm. On the left, we have one attempted burglary. On the right, one resisting arrest that was nonviolent. Here are the resulting risk scores. Seems biased. Did COMPAS at least predict recidivism? It did not seem to do a good job in this case. We have a low risk score with 3 subsequent offenses and a high risk score with no subsequent offense. One more case, 2 individuals arrested for shoplifting. Priors, for one, we had domestic violence, aggravated assault, grand theft, petty theft, and drug trafficking, and the other simply had petty theft. Here are the risk scores, and the low risk score recipient had one following grand theft, whereas the medium risk score recipient went on to commit no crime. There are many, many stories like these. Let's take a look at the population level. Here are the distributions of risk scores. For the Black population, it's roughly even, and for the white population, it's skewed towards lower risk score. ProPublica is not the only entity that has done an analysis, right? We find that 20% of the time is about the rate that COMPAS, at least in the most recent things that I've read, is predicting violent crime. As far as predicting general crime, you're at about a coin toss. Another issue is that it's not predicting recidivism really at all. You're 2 times more likely to get a high risk score and go on to commit no crime if you're Black compared to if you're white. And so before I close off on this AI story, I do want to state that bias in the criminal justice system is not new. So AI isn't coming in inherently evil compared to what was already in existence. But if AI is meant to even this out, there must be something done in terms of transparency in the algorithms and correcting the algorithms, because the data that we're working with is already biased. So I want to wrap up by talking about some things that we can all do as scientists. three major categories. One, in research, we can consider the sources of bias in our own research. What are your training sets, for example? The issue with facial recognition, which is a common example of bias, was that a lot of companies used mostly white males to train their recognition systems. So of course, it's not going to recognize other individuals. Consider diversity. Who are you hiring? Who are you collaborating with? It's really important to make sure that the people that you're surrounding yourself with and the people that compose your field are diverse. Unfortunately, major companies are ousting prominent AI ethicists like Dr. Timnit Gebru. And so it seems like we're heading in the opposite direction more recently. In terms of education, we can educate ourselves and others in historical and present racism, limitations, and hopefully more statistics for everyone. And in advocacy, there's also plenty that we can do. For example, we have SCAN NYU, founded by Weiji Ma and others, and here we can lend a hand as scientists and work with individuals and other entities and provide them with our ability to read hard papers and disseminate that information, do analysis, or visualize data that they need help visualizing. Finally, I just want to end by saying I'm no expert in the fields that I talked about today, but I can highly recommend Superior, Medical Apartheid, and Coded Bias for further information on this topic. And that is all I have.
So we're immediately going to go to some of the questions that appeared in the chat. So let's start with two questions for David. Actually, there's one question for David, then one for Habon, and then one for David again. So what was the most shocking or interesting thing that you found looking back at the origin history of quote-unquote scientific ideas about race?
I mean, so much of it is shocking. I guess what I find, particularly harrowing to read about is, the extent to which the scientists and the scientific community contributed to, truly oppressive and discriminatory policies here in the U.S. That the eugenics movement and was, as I said, considered, cutting edge science, and it wasn't that it was just a subset of scientists. This was the consensus view at the time, and so as such, these policies that had this backing, this scientific backing, were had a lot of power, and so to me that's a pretty confronting history, and especially I think one other interesting aspect is that many of the scientists who I teach in my classes who made seminal contributions to human genetics, to statistics, these scientists were leading advocates of, these policies. So Francis Galton, as I mentioned, invented linear regression. Carl Pearson, Fisher, who invented ANOVA, Haldane, who was a famous population geneticist and made very important contributions. They were promulgators of these same ideas, and I think that's challenging to learn about and understand that.
You're muted.
Sorry. A question for Habon from Adriana. Any ideas on how we can begin to dispel misinformation that leads to detrimental race bias within medical communities? I guess you started answering that on the last slide.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it can start small, right? When I was starting to think about what I wanted to talk about, what might be most impactful, I just called a friend who's a med student at Harvard, and I learned a lot about kind of what's going on, what they're being educated on. There are so many texts out there, so I recommended one, Medical Apartheid, but there are plenty of other ones that you can find that are also cited in the back of books like Superior and Medical Apartheid. I think that just talking to people around you does a lot. I think COVID has illuminated a lot of the problems in different communities and myths. I think one of the most unfortunate things is this fact that you're raising your hands and saying, maybe it's genetics, maybe it's an issue in the Black community for that reason. And so a lot of people are not really accountable or thinking deeply about the real reasons why there are disproportionate health outcomes. So really just talking to people around you, using your platform in any way you can. I think a lot just goes over people's heads, and I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you. And this question is probably for both of you. What would be the most effective way of scientifically telling or convincing people that race is not real, that it's not a biological concept? Referring to the genetic diversity, anything else? David, do you want to give that a try?
I think that is the most compelling evidence, is that that original study in 1972 by Richard Lewontin, and there have been many subsequent studies showing, using DNA sequencing now, that show that the point is that the vast majority of variation occurs within human populations, however they're defined, and not between populations. And so I think that is the point. But then at the same time, I think the challenge that we face is that if we then turn our attention as biomedical scientists to one particular population, that what we learn may not be necessarily transferable to other populations. And so we cannot ignore the differences between humans. The differences are a result of both social and genetic factors, but these sort of understanding the origin of these classifications and what their implications are is what we need to do as scientists.
Habon.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think also in some of the cases I brought up, we're in a tricky place. If we want to acknowledge the harm of racism, we're kind of stuck almost drawing these arbitrary racial lines, right, to describe what people do when they see someone. And so we just need to be responsible about that. And I think, again, yeah, we don't want to ignore variation, but we have to be very clear that what that variation is and where the lines that describe the variation is, like ancestry versus race. I think just the way that we talk about it and the words we use when we describe the lines we draw in populations are going to be, I think, among the most impactful things as scientists moving forward.
Yeah, and maybe just to add something briefly to that, like it might almost sound like it's an academic distinction, to what extent is race biological construct or a social construct, but it has real implications, because if you realize that most of racial disparities are due to social and environmental factors, then that's a call for action, right? Because those are the factors that you can actually do something about. You can ask yourself, what are the systemic policies that are in place that have caused those disparities. So yeah. It really changes your mindset.
I agree, and I think also, right, we should learn how to default on believing this is social and not biological in any way, and not say, hey, maybe we found something biological, would also be a very important thing.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions about further reading. So Stephanie is asking, in addition to the books and articles referenced here, do either of you have favorite thought leaders in racism, in AI, science, medicine that you recommend following? And then for Habon specifically, what are good references about the transparency issue for the AI inputs for some of the systems you mentioned?
I can start since it mentioned some of the systems. Yeah. So really, for me, the thought leaders, particularly in AI, were like Dr. Tanit Gebru. So if you're looking at these AI ethicists that are being ousted from places like Google, they have a long history of being very vocal, of actually kind of being academic. So you're actually studying some disparities in things like AI. If you watch Coded Bias, there are a number of thought leaders in that particular documentary, and actually they've already had an impact. For example, upon pointing out bias in facial recognition systems, right? For example, IBM actually replicated some of these findings internally and vastly improved their ability to recognize all sorts of different faces. So I think that, those three I picked mostly because there are a bunch of thought leaders within that. As far as medicine, Dr. Eniaka from the 2019 paper that I cited, prominent, gives a lot of events, especially at Harvard, about, for example, nephrology and disparities there. So those are the main people that I look to. Additional sources, I mean, I just kind of searched through the literature. Again, ProPublica provided a lot of the stories towards the end. So there's a ton, and there's a ton at the back of those books and sources that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we can put some additional readings on the Cosyne website if there is interest in doing that. David.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate, I mean, Habon recommended that everyone read Superiority, or Superior, I call it, yeah. And so that is certainly, that's a book that's just come out in the last year or two, and is a really, is a great read. I became very interested in the eugenics movement in the US, and there's a book by Daniel Kevles, I forget the name right now, but it's a very authoritative, history of the eugenics movement, and particularly in the US, that I think is a history that's really important to know. And I believe there's a documentary that's come out fairly recently that I'm not sure of at the moment, but I think we'll have to provide that link afterwards.
Sure. So there's a question from Jesse Verheyen. The hugely influential scientist who promoted, it just scrolled away from me, who promoted racist ideology were also leaders of how science and our institutions progressed. So how do you root out the cultural, quote unquote, sickness resulting from that legacy? So I find that a very interesting question, because one way of looking at the material that you presented, David, is, well, the scientists in the past, they were all misguided, and somehow everything has gotten all rosy now, and we've gotten rid of those toxic misconceptions. It's probably not that simple.
It's certainly not that simple, and I'm not sure I captured all the question because you were breaking up a bit, Weiji, but I think it actually recurs. And although I stopped my history in 1972, essentially, a notorious example was the publication of the Bell Curve, which I think came out in the 80s or 90s, which was a large authoritative analysis of academic accomplishment in the US that had a very much a racist underpinning. And there are prominent scientists who have extremely problematic views that inform their work, and that at least until fairly recently, they felt fairly comfortable advancing those views in public settings. And so I think the point is that we need to be really vigilant about poor science that is being used for justification for discriminatory practices, and it's certainly not over. And I think that is covered really well in the book Superior as well. So that was part of the motivation for that book.
So a question for Habon. You mentioned that we should use better genetic markers as predictors for disease. Wouldn't that lead to non-racial eugenics, especially when combined with AI?
Sorry, I think I'm not interpreting the question correctly. So we're using better biomarkers. Do we think that perhaps, for example, we target other populations? Because in my mind, I kind of see using better biomarkers and completely removing essentially all of these corrections would just lead to a basic number. Of course, I don't think that, these are estimates. I think that the way that I'd answer it, and I'm happy to clarify further, these are estimates, and this is something that physicians will say over and over again. Really, this is just a huge part of a problem where you'd want to think about what's going on more holistically. How is this patient declining in kidney function, right? What are the other social determinants of health that they're dealing with? In what ways could they possibly be more at risk than other patients? So I think that we want to move towards maybe a better biomarker that allows us to treat everyone the same and not have all of these corrections that treat people differently. But then also, obviously, make sure that we're using our common sense and not just relying so much on AI, especially when it's not appropriately accounting for all of the factors that go into this thus far. So I'm not advocating for the use of an equation solely.
Yeah, I guess one way to interpret Chantal's question is that good predictors for a disease, whether they're genetic or otherwise, could always be abused, right? So if you are an insurance company and you have a really good genetic predictor of disease, then you would raise premiums on those at greater risk, which could increase disparities.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just my personal addition. I don't know if that's... Yeah.
I think that's a valid interpretation. I kind of like partially answered it, but yes, to be fair, that's an awesome part to the question, right? This wouldn't be like pre-genetic screening. This would be, you have a problem, you get blood draw. So that's a little bit removed in that way, but I completely agree that this shouldn't be something that plays out in terms of risk factors in insurance companies for all of the reasons that we stated.
So one question that got a lot of votes from Eric Shea Brown is, we are here talking to a community of neuroscientists and systems and computational neuroscientists who do lab work, and they do not necessarily, or computational work, and they don't necessarily work very closely to medical practice or to applied art. What lessons should this community draw from what either of you has said? Like, what should we change in terms of our behavior or how we speak about race? What kind of ethical aspects or ethical failings should we try to discover in our own work? Whoever wants to go first.
Did you want to go first, David? I feel like I talked quite a bit recently.
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm a geneticist now working with a model organism. And I guess the question is, maybe you could also say, well, I'm an organic chemist. Why do I need to know this history? And why do I need to think about this? And I think, as Habon said, we need to think about this at all levels, not just the history of scientific racism, the role that it still plays in bias in today's society, and the challenge of addressing human population differences in contemporary science. But we also need to be thinking about, diversity within our own workplace and, impediments to increasing that diversity. And I think that's something that if we look around in our own academic departments, that there's a lot of work we can be doing in all the science disciplines in that respect. And
related to that, there's a question from Janelle. I'll just give my own preface to this question. So when the opioid crisis became to the front, then everybody realized that the Sacklers were instrumental in promoting that crisis and making a lot of money off of it. And then across the nation, there was this movement of removing their names from buildings and programs, etc. And so, David, since you have explained to us that some of the leaders in statistics also had these racist and eugenicist ideas, should there be some accountability there that we should remove their names from tests, like the Pearson correlation coefficient should be renamed? Or are there other ways that we can acknowledge history while still continuing to use our tools?
That is a really great point. And, the attack that I have taken is to explicitly address, so I teach Pearson correlation and I teach linear regression, and I teach it in a human genetics class where I talk about, the motivation for development of those methods. But until a few years ago, I did not talk about the darker history of those geneticists. And I think that is the right thing to do. We can't go back and, erase names. But I think if we know that history, I think that that is really the approach that I've been trying to take and teaching that history to our students.
There was a clarification from Chantal, so maybe I misinterpreted what Chantal meant. Chantal meant that science is constantly updated and AI would roll with earlier science and then learn from its own predictions? And how do we bring these topics to colleagues who aren't interested? Those might be two separate questions.
Okay, I think I heard it. I cut off for a moment. So basically, how do we deal with previous biased data before it gets out of control in the use of AI?
Yeah, let's see if that's perhaps what Chantal means. Yeah.
Okay, I can start speaking to that. Feel free to stop me if that's not the interpretation. But yeah, I mean, this is awesomely addressed in Superior, actually, this idea of an indexing problem. We're building and building and building off of things that may or may not be perfect. I think we can have a conversation about the data that we use. I think one move to make in AI is to use kind of racism as a variable. So I guess we can't have no data, and we're not changing human behavior, unfortunately, fast enough or anytime soon. So the data will continue to be biased. We can have a conversation about not using this at all, these AI tools right now. But I think that if we have to use the AI tools, or if they're mandated as they are increasingly, at the heart of it will be the algorithm. It has to account for it. You know, it might be fair in a perfect world that, I guess, had crime, but it's currently not fair because of the data. So I agree, it's an open topic, but I think the algorithm is really the place to go potentially.
And related to that, there was a question from John Vastola, which is how are medical or criminal justice institutions responding, if much at all? Is there generally a great openness to change, and are these biases and these forms of racism acknowledged and actively fought, or is there resistance and denial?
Yeah, I think that especially with the medical field, there isn't so much resistance or denial. It seems like there's a lot of programming. They seem to be listening to some prominent physicians who study this. And if University of Washington was any indication, we're moving towards things, and we're funding research into other alternatives to creatinine, be they better biomarkers or other better measures. So I think that that's important. In terms of the criminal justice system, it doesn't seem like things are moving quite as quickly. I mean, a lot of these analyses weren't that old, but some of them were from 2016, and I haven't seen much in the form of improvement to the algorithm, but it hasn't been perhaps quite as bad as rejecting analyses as the facial recognition, like big companies like Google. I will say that companies like Compass will come out and say, we reject your analysis, but they're not gonna, share much information, if any, and they're still underperforming. So I feel that less is happening in criminal justice reform.
I wanted to, Weiji, can I go back to the question? I think the second question was, how do we deal with colleagues who aren't interested in learning about the history and the issues? And I think that's a really tough issue, but I do think that's a minority of our colleagues, because what we learned here at NYU is that, actually over the summer of 2020, the graduate students came to us and said, why are we not learning this history, and why are we not teaching it? And there was actually, the program that Weiji has set up here at NYU is in response in part to that realization that we aren't addressing this issue. So I think, in fact, the vast majority of our open-minded colleagues are interested in learning about both the history and the current issues associated with racism in science. And so I think, there's an opportunity to look in your own institution at ways of trying to address this topic.
Thank you. There's an anonymous question. How important is it to acknowledge established racial gaps that have created different socioeconomic, political, medical outcomes for corrective policies, given the risk of further consolidating these categories?
Yeah, I mean, it is highly important, right? Racism, for example, if we go back to the medical field, I don't know if I mentioned this while I was talking, but that has like literal physiological stress-related impacts. There are reparations to be made, and we can't really do that. And this is a conversation, and I feel it's hard to do that without kind of acknowledging historical boundaries. I think that in the future, we should not be drawing these boundaries for other future studies of populations and differences, certainly. But I think to address the past, we kind of potentially just have to confront it head on.
Thank you. I also see that there's people helping to answer questions in the chat. Thank you so much, including several reading recommendations. So I would encourage you to check those out. So let's see if we have any unanswered questions here. I think we're going to do one more call for questions before we end the event. So, okay, there's one that just came in. If racial disparities are explained by the social determinants of health, does that mean that anti-racism is about fixing these class differences politically?
I guess since I mentioned it, so yeah, in part, right, anti-racism is making sure that, you know, even if you're not in one of these groups it's most targeted, that others have equal opportunities to, and they're not targeted. You know, beyond just social determinants of health, it's you know, that's not necessarily listed, is the act of racism itself. Racist attacks, microaggressions, macroaggressions, right? Just being a good bystander and being an ally. I think that anti-racism is not being racist, of course, and the question, I think whoever asked that knows that. It's really actively trying to change these huge structural problems as best we can.
David, did you want to chime in on that?
I don't know that I have much more to offer. I mean, I have heard it said that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And so maybe that's just something to reflect on. And I think that's consistent with the, you know, the idea of anti-racism and addressing the systemic racism that, you know, operates at all levels in our society.
So there's a related question that just came in. Telling people that race is a social concept leads to people thinking I'm saying that race is not an important factor. So I guess that's definitely not what we're saying. So how can we convey that this is not the case?
I think the simple answer is that race, as we use it in the United States, has no biological basis, but it's a very much real reflection of people's lived experience. And so it is very much, you know, a real concept, but the key point being that it has no relation to human genetics.
Question from Daniel Okobi: how might we use this information to help change disparities in the people who do neuroscience itself, given that they appear throughout many countries?
That's a deep question, right? Different countries have different problems with racism. I mean, I certainly think, though, these examples carry over in terms of demonstrating what happens when we don't have diversity in dealing with a lot of these issues. As far as neuroscience specifically, right, I didn't really bring up a neuroscience example because, to my knowledge, there wasn't one that perhaps drove our points home as well as something like the kidney example. It has a history. With neuroscience, we're increasingly entering more clinical applications. We're increasingly having better tools where we can study human behavior. I've definitely seen, you know, very phrenology-like publications come out in major journals. So I think that there's plenty we can do to speak out against that as it comes out. But even before that, disseminating this sort of information from other fields can potentially prevent people from trying to draw categories in patients in things like fMRI studies or talk about aggression in a racially divided way, as I've seen in way too recent history. So I think that you can take this and carry it over and really try and draw parallels to marginalized populations outside of the United States.
Thank you. I would like to end with a quick question from Eric Shea Brown. Have you included this crucially important material in curriculum within pre-existing science classes, for example, a module or within specific lectures? I actually say something about that myself, because we've, David, Habon, many others, and I have thought about that a lot at NYU. So for the moment, we've decided to do a standalone workshop that is going to be mandatory for most PhD students and postdocs at NYU, and strongly encouraged for faculty and others. And there was no mechanism to mandate it for faculty. But this will be a workshop consisting of 4 lectures. David is going to give one of them, very similar to the one today. There's going to be a sociologist speaking, somebody on bias in AI, and somebody on bias in medicine. So Habon gave a short version of the last 2 lectures today. And the departments of neuroscience, biology, and psychology were fully supportive of making these events community-wide and hopefully recurrent, so that future generations of trainees and faculty will similarly be educated. We've also spoken about potentially starting a separate class, but of course that might reach a smaller audience because it would have to fit into people's class schedules. And yours, Eric, including this information throughout science courses, I think is a really important one that we haven't fully worked on yet, but I think that David and colleagues are committed to actually putting that information into their classes. David, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in the biology department at NYU, we're looking for opportunities in every class, introductory biology, genetics, human genetics, to teach, this history and to address this topic explicitly. And I think it's, just it's a new awareness of the fact that we have completely neglected to do that in the past. And so, but I think integrating it into classes, in addition to having this separate series that we're going to do for the first time this year, I think that's the approach that we want to take here.
How about any additions?
No, I agree completely. I mean, I guess I don't. Thank you, first of all. You invited me to the committee as a student representative. I'm honestly just learning from both of you, but I think that from a student perspective, there's a lot that we can do to kind of talk amongst ourselves or advocate for this, as we have to sort of be required for ourselves. So I think that as a TA, what I try to do in addition is that when I am teaching in a course and I do maybe bring up a controversial name, at least for a moment, talk about the gravity of this individual and some of the things that they've done. So I try to include it informally. I'm actually co-teaching a high school class in neuroscience this semester, and I've worked with my teacher co-mentor to kind of have different modules on the history of race science. He taught for an entire week about the history of racism in science before I even joined. And so little things interspersed into class can really make a big difference.
Thank you, Habon. Yeah, so I think that's a good note to end on. So if this mini-symposium has left you with a desire to do something yourself, then of course, one way is to educate yourself using the reading recommendations that we and others provided. But if you're at an institution where you can make some more systemic change, then you could consider introducing this kind of material into either a standalone workshop or make it part of the ethics training or embed it into existing courses. We're happy to help with that. I'll make sure that a link to our workshop is going to be posted on the Cosyne website as well, in case that's a useful point of reference. And I think we're all 3 happy to be contacted with further questions. Thank you very much, David and Habon, for being our great panelists today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I would like to end by pointing you to a diversity, equity, inclusion event tomorrow, where we are going to have a research symposium that is aimed to broaden participation from underrepresented minorities at Cosyne. and highlight diverse areas of research in our field. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you, Weiji.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.